name is Michael Nagel. I've been leading change with life sciences organizations for the past 20 years. This is another segment in my video blog series on the 7 elements of change leadership. In each of these postings, I will try to keep it simple so it can be used by wider audiences and try to explain some of the behavioral sciences thinking that's behind actions that I routinely encourage my clients to take. So in this video blog series, we're focused on managing the emotions of change. So let's talk about what emotions you can expect. As you may know, change causes a lot of different types of emotions, and they're not pretty. They can include shock, fear, anxiety, anger, confusion, chaos. And these are the same types of emotions that you'll see in personal lives when people experience big losses like illness or death or divorce. And unfortunately, they can show up in the workplace if you've got big change resulting in big loss for people in the workplace. Now, you can directly impact these emotions. They can be managed. They can be managed for the better, making them shorter and less intense, or they can be managed for the worse, making them last longer and be more intense. In order to help people through these emotions, you first have to realize that it's normal to experience these emotions. So when they show up, you have to say, oh, we must be affecting change. Second, you have to sort of discover within yourself how you react to the emotions. You can't be afraid of these emotions because you have to be able to remain calm, cool, and collected when other people are experiencing them, if you're going to be able to help them manage their emotions. So I've come to realize that with organizational change, if you're creating change that requires, new behaviors as a result of some loss, something that's not in people's control, then you will experience some of these emotions. Quite often it'll be the anxiety or the anger or shock, really all of them. And if you're creating change and it's a large-scale change, oftentimes chaos is involved in that. That's why you see this cycle of change referred to or looks like a tornado, because change turns things upside down, creates chaos. Chaos creates confusion and anxiety. So you have to realize that. But you can shorten these cycles and make that less intense. And that's what, as a change leader, you're trying to do. So to help us understand and manage the emotions of change, it's helpful to look at a model. And the model that I like to look at, and I have found applies all the time, is work done by Elizabeth Kubler Ross. And it's from her research and findings on grief. But when people experience loss, they experience grief related to that loss or change. Elizabeth Kubler Ross, working with death and dying, first documented the grief cycle in the 1950s and published it in her groundbreaking work called On Death and Dying. And since that time, organization development consultants have shown, and scientists have shown, that this model, this grief cycle from Kubler Ross, can be applied in organizations. So this Kubler Ross grief cycle is normally depicted as a curve or a valley, and it has predictable stages in it. Kubler Ross said that people usually demonstrate at least 2 of these stages, and not necessarily always in this order. The stages that we'll see are denial, where we have emotions like avoidance, confusion, elation, shock, fear. And then we would see anger, which shows up as frustration with the situation, or irritation or irritability with the situation, or anxiety around the situation. What's going to happen? What's going to happen to me? We might see, a stage like depression, where people feel just overwhelmed with all this change, or they feel helplessness. There's nothing we can do. You might see some hostility, and if this goes on a long time, you can see flight, where people tend to exit the organization at this stage. And then we will see bargaining. And in bargaining, this is where in workshops, people start to engage. They're struggling to find meaning with this, and they want, to talk to people, and they're reaching out to others, and they want to tell their story. So this is when it's helpful to be doing current state analysis and could be discussions about the future. And then people start to get to acceptance. And once they realize that it's going to happen, and they'll explore different options for what the future might look like, different options for how it can be put in place, what their role might be in that new future, and eventually a new plan gets put in place and they move on. Now, these are predictable responses, and there are ways to impact this curve. You can impact the amount of emotion that people experience, and you can impact the amount of time it takes to go through the cycle, or the amount of time that people spend in these various stages. And we'll take a look at that next. All right, so what are some of the things that you can do to help reduce the emotion and shorten this cycle of grief? Kind of shorten it up. First, you have to recognize that in many cases, if you're seeing these emotions, then it would be appropriate to see more of them. And you'd actually be looking to see the cycle play out. And that would actually be a sign that demonstrates progress, believe it or not. The other thing that's important to do with people is that when they finally demonstrate anger, which means that they're recognizing that something's going to change, you have to acknowledge that. You have to acknowledge that loss. And with that, you want to help them understand what's not changing. So that's why we try to tell people what is changing and what is not changing. Now, before people get angry, they're in shock and denial, and you have to be patient, and you have to be willing to express your messages quite often. Because when these emotions are coming up, it's blocking people's ability to hear, it's blocking their ability to understand. So you have to offer them many opportunities to hear the same messages until one day it finally sinks in. Some of the messages that people need to hear, they need to understand: how is the change going to be created? Who's involved? How long will it take? What is the process? Because if they're experiencing fear or confusion, then they need this kind of information. But they also need to understand what the future looks like. And so they need vision. They need you to help them understand that there is a future, and that if they move towards it, they can get there. They need you to be an empathetic listener, to demonstrate that you understand the emotions that they're going through. Not be a sympathetic listener and agree with their emotions, but to help recognize that their emotions are real. And you have to give them, in order to even get to that point, to be a good listener, you have to give them safe opportunities to express these emotions, which is why we do a lot of interventions that are face-to-face, workshops, other types of group interventions, or one-on-one with people, so they have an opportunity to vent out the emotions and move on. The final point to consider is that leaders in organizations oftentimes go through this grief cycle ahead of their employees. And this is because leaders are most often involved in the change longer than their employees, because they've been planning it, strategic planning sessions, or they had access to some confidential information, so they knew longer. And so as a result, these leaders will pass through the grief cycle and accept the future state before their employees may even know that something is going to change. And of course, many of these leaders tend to forget how they initially responded to the news about the big changes, like from a merger or downsizing. They forget that they were angry or wanted to deny it, or were confused about what would get done. So as a change leader, you have to help leaders realize that the emotions that people in their organization are displaying may not actually be intentional resistance, just the normal response to the change. When the leader thinks it's a great future state, and why wouldn't you accept it? Why would you be angry? Sometimes you have to help them understand it's a normal process. All right, so that was a brief overview of how to apply Kubler Ross's grief cycle and how to, improve or manage the response to big changes. I hope it's been helpful.